Lifetime Achievement Award, pretty cool, right? I've given talks before congressional subcommittees, before the FDA, all over the world. Nothing has stressed me out. Like trying to figure out what the hell I was going to say for an hour here. So I'm going to give you the remote that I left over. Oh, yeah. So these are my disclosures. You'd think with 40 years in this business I'd have some disclosures. Couldn't think of anything particularly interesting or conflicted. Trying to reflect back on what I've done, what I haven't done, what I should have done, what I claim to have done. There's going to be some embellishments, so those of you who've known me, just cut me some slack. There may be some actual outright fabrications. Again, cut me some slack. What I did realize is that there's not a single thing I've done in these 40 years that I've done alone that I can take credit for. So I'm going to accept this award on behalf of over 400 people that I could identify, that I won't be able to identify during this hour. So friends, colleagues, many of you who are here, this is for you as well, and I want to thank you. Also, it's kind of weird talking about yourself for an hour, so I will try to be brief. This is my favorite quote from Mark Twain. The older I get, the more clearly I remember things that never happened. So that's what we'll talk about. In trying to decide how to do this, I listened to some Lifetime Achievement Award presentations. There's a great one by Roger Federer, at Dartmouth, if no one's listened to it. And I heard, there seem to be two classes. You either talk about what you've published, what your work was, when you did this article, when you did that article, when you got this job, when you got that job. Pretty boring. I mean, you can read the papers if you want to know the science. But the circuitous path from where you started to where you ended up seems to be more interesting. And so that's what I'm going to do with this talk. As tradition has it, we start with a clinical vignette, and this is a story about Fanny. So Fanny is an 80-year-old lady who basically thinks of her life as a failure. When you talk to her, she just kind of has that kind of shrunken and apologetic sort of behavior. She wanted to be an actor. She got a BFA. She did her time on Broadway. No great successes there. She came back to LA where she was from. She got big parts in movies and commercials and TV shows here and there. But she needed to pay the bills. And it turns out you do a lot of things in order to pay the bills, and sometimes they turn out to be wonderful, wonderful moves. In her case, she began tutoring bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah kids. Those who don't know what bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah is, it's preparing a bunch of children, 6 to 12 years old, for the most important event in their parents' lives. After a while, she became a full-time teacher at a Hebrew school. She retired after 45 years. She also had a wonderful family. She has grandchildren. She continues to interview for age-appropriate roles, which I guess are pretty thin in the 80-plus year. So think about this failure of a life. Who selects, who decides who deserves a Lifetime Achievement Award? In this case, it was easy. People that I've known for 25 years voted for me, but still voted for me, I should say. But what does it mean? What does it mean to you guys? Why did you get up early to hear this talk? What does it mean to HCOP that we have this sort of thing going on after 18 years? What does it mean to me? I want to take a quick poll. How many in the room have thought about their legacy? Wow. So, Yes Olison came to watch tennis, and if anybody deserves a Lifetime Achievement Award, it's obviously Yes Olison, right? And I asked him the question, and he said, "Oh yes, I've thought about it since the day I started work." I thought, oh shit. I had really never given it any thought. It just wasn't on my radar. So I started thinking about, what is my legacy? What have I done? So I asked my kids, who I consider my legacy, and what Satara, my daughter, the older child, said, well, your legacy is us. You taught us to always give back, to leave the world a better place than you left it. And they've done that. So that's my legacy. Those of you who didn't get breakfast, you can go now. That's the story. But I do have a responsibility here, and I've thought seriously about what it means to me to get this award. It's not trivial. It does have power and impact. But then what do you do? And I think, anybody know who this person is? Peggy Lee. Okay. Does anybody know who Peggy Lee is?
Yeah, I do.
Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing.
That's the bottom line. Mm-hmm. This is a milestone, a signpost, but we keep going on. There's always something coming up. So what is this the conclusion of my clinical presentation? Fanny deserves a Lifetime Achievement Award, and she needs to know that. In fact, I think we all do, just by the fact that we're here. We're vertical, we're giving back, we're doing things. So I want to congratulate you all on a Lifetime Achievement Award. But let's not forget, this is all about me. So I wanted to present a little bit about how I got to be up here doing this. The picture on the left, as I looked at it, is probably one of my first migraines. I was a fussy child, put it mildly. And the picture on the right is a picture of us. This is the international faculty at a meeting in Kolkata. I had a splitting migraine that actually went for 2 of the 4 days of that meeting. And you just kind of keep going. So I'm Bob, I'm a migraineur, as we say in our 12-step program. How did I get to this path? When was the die cast? When was it decided? So I found this early picture of me, and I have partnered it with a more recent picture, not of me. But you'll notice where the eyes are. I just want to keep an eye on the people who are looking in the other direction. That's as far as political as I'm going to get. I'm going to try to keep it as apolitical as I can, but that's. So how did I get here? I think the theme that I keep hearing from people who know me is that I always seem to go my own way. I don't seem to be particularly mindful, whether I should or shouldn't, of what others are. So this is a picture of me in San Gabriel with my brother, who was an Eagle Scout. Well, in this picture, he's a first-class Scout. He became an Eagle Scout. And my little sister, who I guess was a ballerina at that point, I'm not sure. But I wouldn't take the picture without my cap. Fast forward 10 years, this is me in 1970 when I was supposed to be in college, but I was actually in Afghanistan, traveling around in a bus with a bunch of other hippies. And my brother, the Eagle Scout, was living on a commune in Santa Cruz. So you never know where you're going to go. I did have an early exit from the Boy Scouts of America after working on my merit badge at campfire building inside the tent. I did drop out of high school in the middle of my senior year and dropped out of college several times. Another talk. So I spent a long time not preparing to become a doctor. My first job was as a brusher of mohair in a factory. My dad's factory. He was one of 4 people who started Catalina Knitwear. No college education. And I did that that was my summer job in high school. In my senior year, I took a job as a car hop on skates at Tui's Alhambra. Also in 1967, and this is why I dropped out of high school, is I had my first fiction piece published in the New Yorker. And I thought, well, me, Jack Kerouac, all of these people. I just figured I was going to be a writer, and I was on my way. I got $50 for that. There wasn't a lot of activity after getting the article accepted in the New Yorker. My parents managed to get me a high school diploma and into college, unbeknownst to me, more or less. I then managed to pay the bills with a part-time job as purveyor of fine herbs and spices, mostly herb. And went through college. My first job out of college was building a cabin up in the mountains of it was Mount Lemmon, Arizona. And I was good, we had a commune of people who were building this cabin. Unfortunately, we were about 20 feet onto Forest Service land, and Forest Service waited until we built that entire structure before they told us it had to be moved. So that was sort of the end of that career. So I came back to LA, got a job as a special education teacher. And working with the kids in special education is probably where I got my first inklings of there being a career, a path forward, looking at the brain and how these kids manage their lives not being straight and normal, so to speak. But also in 1973, I got my second publication. I sold a script to MASH. It was never produced, unfortunately. But it paid me a lot more money. It was over $1,000. And it's like, okay, we're back on track now. I'm going to be a great writer. But again, to pay the bills, I stopped teaching and took a job with a think tank. The RAND Corporation was actually the domestic arm of the RAND Corporation called System Development Corporation. And we sat in the backs of classrooms all over the country looking at the impact of desegregation on education. Fascinating, but that's where my roots in education. So I started to see a connection between education and the brain, and that sort of was, near as I can remember with hindsight, is where this stuff all sort of began. I haven't said enough about that. There. What were the turning points? What kind of got me on this less traveled road? So I took my degree in 1972 in sociology and philosophy. One of the things you got back then, and the point here is that so much of what we do is situational. It's the time and the place. Well, if you graduated college in 72, you were in Vietnam in 73 because we had a draft and it was conscription. But in 73, the draft ended. So instead of, preparing to either go underground or pack my bags for Canada, because I was very much involved in the anti-war movement, as was my brother. Suddenly, I didn't have to leave. I didn't have to go underground. I could be here. I could stay in America. So that was a big deal. But then I had to decide, what am I going to do? What's my role going to be? Shortly thereafter, the war ended, and there wasn't a whole lot for people who had been working 60, 80, 120 hours a week to end the war. And a lot of us were in kind of turmoil. But I decided I was going to get into the neurosciences. But in order to do that, I had to do this stuff called, what was it called? Biology, I think was the term, chemistry. Things you don't learn about with a philosophy degree. And so I went back to Occidental. And that was the event that Judy alluded to. I was sitting out by the pool at a friend's house, reading Dickerson or Morrison and Geiss, some heavy-duty science book, and suddenly someone was blocking my light, standing between me and the sun. It was really annoying. And it was this nerdy person with the pencil thing and different colored markers, and she said, "What are you doing?" Did not know this person, right? I said, I'm studying chemistry. To which she said, that's not how you study chemistry. You sit at a table, you have a yellow marker, you have a blue highlighter, you know, you have your lamp. And she was carrying all of these things. She was here to study. And a number of years later, we married and have been together for 50 years, almost. And that was definitely a turning point. I would not be here without my poor study habits. And so after I got my science background, I went into the PhD program in neurosciences at UCSD. And Mercedes was also finishing her undergraduate. She started at UCLA, she finished her undergraduate at UCSD, and then went back to UCLA for her doctoral work. And we started another company in order to pay the bills. And it was called Continuing Health Education Systems. Because at that time, in that year, suddenly doctors had to have a means of documenting ongoing education. They needed CME credits. And that was fine if you lived in San Diego or New York or Los Angeles, because there were meetings all the time there. But if you lived in Elephant's Breath, Idaho, or Broken Pelvis, Montana, there was no way you could get to those kinds of things. So we started creating instructional objectives and test items for journal articles, which were then published with the journal article for CME. And actually, when we sold that company, it's how I ended up paying for medical school. Those were the turning points. That kind of brings me to be in medical school. So what was my serpentine path? Does anybody recognize the picture at the top? The Serpentine Path, do you remember the movie?
Oh, yeah.
Peter Falk and Alan Arkin, the in-laws?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, so I went to medical school, finished my internship. While I was in medical school, the AIDS epidemic began. And again, it's circumstances, it's what's going on. And I became very involved in AIDS care. I started out volunteering in a pathology lab and working in the AIDS clinic that was started at County General Hospital at SC. While still in training, I took care of a guy named Chris Brownlee. My age, listened to the same music, you know, we saw the same movies, but he was dying from AIDS. And that had a huge impact on me. My first job, actually, full-time job, was as the director of the Chris Brownlee Hospice in Los Angeles. It was a powerful experience because when I started that, people were dying from pneumocystis mostly, lung diseases. And by the time I left that position, people were mostly dying from CNS problems, infections. I also, when I stopped doing that, I came back to SC as an assistant professor. I had done my fellowship in cognitive neurology, Alzheimer's disease. And at one point, my chairman said, there's this new drug for migraine. How would you like to be our migraine doctor? I said, migraine, is that even a thing? There were no fellowships. But after the third or fourth time he asked me, I realized the correct answer was yes, I'd love to do that. But I did have a brief interval that I just want to mention just because it was so cool. I was a doc for the ATP, the Association of Tennis Professionals, for 2 years, which meant I got to go to tennis tournaments, hang out with professional tennis players, hit with some of the professional tennis players, out of charity, obviously. And it was just a cool experience that has nothing to do with anything except that it was really cool. So I started at SC and I enjoyed building the program there. I was incredibly frustrated by the bureaucracy, the administrative barriers, and the stigma, the academic stigma that migraine had, wasn't even worth discussing. So I decided to leave and I moved to Sedona, Arizona. I was going to be a general neurologist. And that of fun. I mean, Sedona's a beautiful place, lots of places to hike. Was able to build some furniture. But I ended up coming back, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. And I started the Keeler Center here, which is how HCOP came to be in Ohio. And I'll talk in detail about that. Then I eventually went to Stanford, and apparently that's where I'll be buried. So how did it begin in headache? So I mentioned Leslie Weiner. He was my chairman, and when Imitrex came on the market in the early 90s, he decided that I was going to be a headache person. So what he did is he sent me back east to what he said was the only headache clinic in the country. Sorry, Alan, but that's what he said. And he sent me to Seymour Diamond. And Seymour is a very interesting guy. He was a primary care doctor who had a thriving business in this headache center. He would not allow me in the room with him when he would go in to see a patient, but he would come out, tell me about the patient, tell me his diagnosis, and about which secret formula he was using to treat them. But he wouldn't tell me what the formulas were until he had a contract with SC to set up Diamond. So what I did while he was in the room, so this sounds horrible, I know it does, and Seymour was not a horrible person. I don't mean to say, he was sort of horrible. While he was in the room, I would stand outside with this bank of nurses who were on the phones at a table that faced the wall, and they were talking to patients. That was the beginning of my education, understanding what was involved in headache medicine. And it was not about Seymour's secret formulas. It was about listening to patients, talking to patients, understanding the circumstances of their life. And so I came back and set about the business of setting up a headache program, because there were no fellowships back then. But I did have the fortune of going to a meeting of this organization called the American Headache Society. Who knew? And it was in a place called Scottsdale, Arizona. How cool is that? So I went to that, and I sat in the front row because I have terrible eyesight and I don't hear very well. And I sat next to a gentleman whose name was John Edmeades. Didn't know him from Adam. But we talked, and I told him what I was doing, and he took me, he took one of his wonderful wings and put me under it. And he took me around, he introduced me to dozens and dozens of people. He asked me questions, he made suggestions. Just an extraordinary person. And we stayed in contact for a few years. He's gone now, of course. But he was just an amazing mentor at my very beginnings. So I mentioned that I moved to Sedona. How did I get back after I strayed to general neurology and came back? Well, there are some patients who won't let go. You all know this, right? And one of these patients that I was seeing at USC was flying out to see me in Sedona in their family's personal plane. And after a while, this was really inconvenient for her, so she wanted to bring me back to where she lived in Ojai. And I talked about what it would take, and at the point, I'd sipped the Sedona Kool-Aid. I was really into complementary and alternative medicine. I really believed in holistic approaches. And so I described to her and then to her father what it would take to bring me back to Ojai. And they said, okay, we can do that, we can do that, we can do that, we can do that. All right, so we came back to Ojai. Simultaneously with that, some colleagues can't take the hint either, and we hit Mike Harrington, are you here? So I had a colleague at Huntington Medical Research Institute, and we had prepared an R01 grant while I was still at SC, and the wheels turned slowly enough that I'd already left for Sedona when the grant came through. So I started commuting back and forth, and so we were doing headache research in Pasadena, and I was in Ojai with this clinic. And it was during that period that I wrote the Keeler book. Keeler was the name of the family that donated all the money to do this. I don't know if it was the first, and it doesn't really matter, but the book really focused on a holistic approach to patient care. And to this day, 30 years later, I still occasionally get the patient, I read your book, and I'm going, which book? And it's the Keeler book. So that's kind of cool. I wish I could talk about all my mentors. There's just so many of them, and every one of them is worth an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. These are just some of the people. As I look at them, I want to tell you a story about each one, and I can't get started. There's just not enough time. But look at these people. You should know their names. You should know what they're about. Here's a few more. These are people who just had tremendous influence on me and how I think about headache. I do want to mention 3 people in particular that go back to my my beginnings and my current experience. The first is Corinne Collins. Corinne was my first NP here in Ojai at the Keeler Center. And she didn't know a lot about headache when she started, but boy did she know about taking care of people. And she was just extraordinary in keeping me focused, not just on the science, but on how to dance around the science in order to take care of people. She was amazing. Carol Barch is kind of a next-gen version of Corinne, and Carol works as my nurse practitioner currently at Stanford. And man, she knows how to work the system. You know, when I'm at the point where I say, I don't think there's any way to get this medicine to you. You know, I've done 3 peer-to-peers, and Carol says, well, why don't we do this? So she's amazing. She again is focused, so patient care focused that she's remarkable. And then the third person here is Brenda Mercado, who's here and doesn't like to have her picture taken, obviously. But she's also a remarkable artist who works out of Ventura and Oxnard area. And she was a licensed marriage and family therapist, but she was a counselor. She was a person who knew how to listen to patients and to make the connections between what's going on with them personally and professionally and their history and to bring it home to how to improve their lives. These 3 women are just extraordinary caregivers, and I wanted to mention them by name. So what were the game changers? Why am I actually here? And HCOP was a game changer. In trying to prepare for this talk, I started to think about, well, how did we actually begin? Because it's kind of blurry. So I started to ask people who have been around this project. And of course, anyone you ask, it was my idea. You know, I thought of it. And then I brought you on. That's not really true. Nobody actually said that. But everybody has a different idea. I mean, I heard 16 different stories. I heard yesterday that there was a founder that I didn't even know had anything to do with our early beginnings. But anyway, it's astonishing how this is a classic example. I love this quote from Margaret Mead, which I've kind of twisted to suit my needs, but the sentiment's clear. Don't for a minute think that whatever you have done has been done by you alone. More often, the opposite is true, my parentheses. Same goes for things you've screwed up. Again, my addition. This was really a collaborative effort. I think if you really had to look for the actual seed of this, it was probably Alan Rappaport coming from the Headache Cooperative of New England out to the West Coast and being astonished and horrified that we didn't have a similar organization on the West Coast. And he talked to Ben, he talked to Susan, he talked to Jack, he talked to me. Very importantly, he talked to Steve Graff Radford, who's no longer with us. And we had some dinners, which many people came, which I guess qualifies them for being founders. And we put together a board. I tried to find some actual documentation. And on paper, the original founders were Susan, Ben, and me. We were the only ones foolish enough to put something in writing. And additionally, I was the only one stupid enough to sign a guaranteed note for $50,000 for the funding of the first 3 years' meetings. I have no recollection of this, my wife does. But there's very poor documentation, but the bottom line is there have been many people involved in this, and many who have been with it for all that 18 years, and I'm just one of them. On the other hand, I did make a couple of significant contributions. One is we're here in Ojai. That $50,000 note was to a bank here in Ojai. The bank president was a friend. The reason we're at the Ojai Valley Inn is one of my patients was the general manager at the time, and she cut us an extraordinary deal. And then thirdly, and perhaps more abstractly, the mission of HCOP, which is to get rid of the silos between science and clinical care, between pharma and academia, and to break down those barriers in a informal, kind of small meeting. We intentionally try to keep this meeting to 100, 150, 200 people, where you can just talk to people in the halls, you can meet. You can't go to theater in LA or San Francisco. You're here, and you're here for a purpose, and that's been the case. It's been an extraordinary experience. I want to say a little bit about how I came to Stanford. Does anybody know the people in this picture? Do any of you play tennis? Good Lord. Yeah. So that's Jimmy Connors and Vitas Gerulaitis.
Oh, yeah.
And Vitas Gerulaitis, after finally beating Jimmy Connors, after losing to him 11 consecutive times, in his post-match interview, he said, "Nobody beats Vitas Gerulaitis 12 times in a row." That's sort of how I feel about Stanford. I applied there as an undergraduate. I think they sent the application back unopened. I applied for medical school. They sent it back unopened. So I don't know, if you remember at the time, you would do a preliminary application for medical school, and if they thought you were worthy based on your numbers, then they'd actually talk to you. I don't know if that's still the case. But when they rejected me out of hand, I sent them a very nasty letter about the injustices of just going by numbers and how they were missing out on opportunities for people who think outside the box. Power to the people, right? And so they sent me an application, allowing me to send another $75 for the secondary application, and then rejected me again.
Oh.
But they came back. Yeah, in 2010, they invited me up to talk about this whole holistic idea I had for headache care. So I did a grand rounds, and afterwards the chairman of neurology took me to dinner and asked me if I wanted to come and be Stanford's headache doc. And I said no. And this had worked once, why not try it a second time? I said, it's got to be a holistic program, it's got to have, I need a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I need social workers, I need counselors, I need this, I need that. And naively, he said, okay, no. And the next month there was an ad in neurology for a headache doctor. But after seeing the field, he came back to me and he said, we can do all of those things. And so I came here with great expectations. We were going to have a freestanding headache center with no fluorescent lighting and a full-time psychologist and all those things. Much of that didn't happen. Never happened. Headache continues to be viewed at Stanford, as at most academic institutions, as a moneymaker. Clinical work. It's very hard to find support for research. On the other hand, we did build a fantastic clinical program. We've had great fellows. Almost every year here we have, this year Netta, one of our former fellows, is speaking. Almost every year someone speaks here who trained at Stanford. So we've done a really good job in those areas. Research, other than me, there's no basic science research going on at Stanford. It's very hard to find people to do basic science. So, bottom line is, sometimes you eat the bear, sometimes the bear eats you. Sometimes you both agree to go hungry. And that's sort of what it's been at Stanford. I'm very grateful that I got the opportunity. I mean, a lot of things have happened to me just because of the Stanford imprimatur. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. The other major game changer came at Stanford, and I think it's worth going through this in some detail because it's very instructive. How you take care of your patients can change the world, even though it's just one patient. So one day I saw a patient, the young man in the middle, Travis. He was 14 at the time. He had an unusual headache. It was side locked, maybe some autonomic features. Just the whole thing didn't hang together. So I got a picture, and he had a lovely AVM. We took him to surgery. Surgery was successful. The headache did not go away. And one day I was taking care and rounding on him, and I usually got rounded on him last just because his mom lived quite a distance away. She was a single parent, so I would kind of hang out with him a little bit. But one day he said, "Would you mind going down and talking to my grandma? She wants to talk to you." And I said, well, you know, I got a thing, I'm gonna do that. Why don't you just have her come up and, you know. And he said, no. She's down in the car in front of the hospital. He said, the thing is, you can't sit in the car in front of the hospital. The cops move you away, you know, I'd have to go look. And he goes, trust me, she's down in the car in front. Okay. So I go down, big black car sitting in front. Window goes down. An old man motions me in. Very sweet little lady. And I mean little, she's like 4'10". She motions me into the car and she thanks me for taking such good care of her grandson and said she wanted to give me a present. And so she hands me a check for $10,000, made out to me.
Wow.
Right? You know what kind of motorcycle you could get for it? I said, no, I can't accept it. It's very sweet. If you want to give it to me for research, you know, maybe, you know, we can get a handle on why some people have these persistent headaches after